Everyone, how are you? Glad you're joining me this afternoon in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. We're going to have a great chat, as we always do. So, I'm going to jump right down into business, give a little bit of a roundup before we do our roll call and have everyone tell us who they are and where they're from. Glad you're all here. We're having a great day. So, I'm going to pour some of the beverage that will not be named. Pouring it ever so slowly. And say that I just had a great time out in Los Angeles. It was amazing. It was really, really a great time. I went out to Los Angeles. My good longtime friend Ramiro and his good longtime friend Ophelia put me up in their lovely place. I got to spend time with them, got to visit Griffith Observatory, and we had a great event in Los Angeles. It was great. It was tremendous. And I got to meet a lot of people. There are a lot of folks that are part of this community who I've never met before. And some of you drove in from Phoenix. Some of you drove in from Ventura, California. Some of you were already in the Los Angeles area. And some of you were from other parts of California. But it was really, really great to see you all. That shows how special this community that we are building here really is. It was really great to be out there in LA. And so that leads me to make the point that if you are in another part of the United States, like Los Angeles, like West Virginia, like Montana, and you want to have me come on out, if you want to help arrange for me to come out and give a talk at your university or at some community center out there, if we want to arrange kind of a meetup, community get-together for the folks that are part of what we're doing here out in your area, let's do it. I know there's already talk of an event in Phoenix, Arizona, that is in the works. I've done events in Boston. I've done events in Providence, Rhode Island. So, let's do it. Let's make this community that we build bigger, stronger, and closer, because we're doing something really, really special. I had a great time. I don't get out to the West Coast very often, but when I do, I always enjoy it. I had a great time. The weather out there is just what I needed. The sunshine, the fresh air, the warmth. It's starting to get cold. It's starting to get a little bit cold in New York City, but it sure is not cold out in Los Angeles. I had a great time. And the video's up. The video is up there. So, I spoke for about a little under an hour. And then I did a Q&A discussion. We got to hear some kind of in-depth questions from people that are part of this community. It was really, really great. I got to meet a lot of you, and I really, really enjoyed it. So if you haven't watched the event yet, the talk I gave is called A Does Not Equal A, Talking Socialism in Los Angeles. Doing very well on YouTube, I must say. Well over 1,000 views within the first 2 days. So if you are interested in watching it, I encourage you to check it out. And if you want to do something in your area, let's do it. Let's have me get on a plane and we'll go out there. Let's try to have an event. Let's get together and have more of these kind of meetups, because you all are really, really special to me. I got to tell you, I deeply care about all of you. You deeply care about me. Trust me. Whenever I miss a week or not doing a live, I've got people texting at me and leaving me messages. When's your next live? Please, when's your next live? Oh, I got to see you. This is really special what we're doing here. I'm gradually learning how to do this. I know a lot of you listen to me during your daily commute. A lot of you drive to work or drive around a lot for work, and I'm kind of the background noise, or I'm the entertainment as you're driving. That's totally cool. I'm glad that I can do that. I'm glad that our conversations can play that role in your life. I know that a lot of you are folks who listen to YouTube all day, and you don't just listen to me. You listen to like Abby Martin, you watch the Chris Hedges show, you follow, RT, you follow Press TV, you follow anything that is anti-imperialist and questioning the lies of our society, specifically about foreign policy. And I think that's very, very cool as well. I know we've all got our eyes on the elections in Argentina, which are happening shortly. This is a great community, really. I really love what we are doing here on these Saturday afternoon chats. Sometimes they're on Sunday. I really love everything that we're doing, and we're part of a network. And people are listening to what we say. People like what we do. And sometimes I think that what we do here is almost kind of like the Velvet Underground. And forgive me if you're not a fan of rock music, but there was a band in the 1970s called the Velvet Underground. And they were never as famous as the Beatles, never as famous as the Rolling Stones, never as famous as any of these mainstream rock bands, right? They talk about, their first album, The Velvet Underground, and Nico. Not that many people bought it, but everyone who did started a band. That they were doing things that had not been done before in rock and roll music. They were experimenting. They were on the edge. They were avant-garde. And they blazed the trail that allowed the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and everyone who came later, Pink Floyd and, all these later rock bands, Led Zeppelin, to do what they did, because they did it first. And the reason that they were doing it first, mind you, the reason they were able to do it first is because they weren't as big as these mainstream rock bands. They were a little more independent. They had a connection with Andy Warhol, but they weren't, the big record labels are reluctant to take risks, right? They don't want to take risks, right? Well, the Velvet Underground, being a smaller band, was able to try new things. They weren't having the record execs breathing down their neck, and they were able to try new things, and that laid out an example that then these bigger bands with much bigger following, they could follow it. And it's funny, I have noticed that happening with what we do here. I can't get too much into specifics. I don't want to cause a big drama. But there are a lot of voices nowadays that are starting to sound more socialistic and more Marxist and more anti-imperialist. And there are a lot of voices that maybe were talking Marxism and socialism. But you'll notice that in the past year, in the past few months, they've started to sound a lot more like me. I'm not going to name names, but there are a lot of people who watch these lives that we do, right? There's a lot of you watching right now, and sure, it's not tens of thousands of people watching here, but, within 2 or 3 days, over 1,000 have watched. Usually well over 1,000 people watch every conversation we do here. And you'll notice that some of these voices that sounded a little more like Bernie Sanders are starting to sound a little more like us. We have an influence, but we're blazing trail. We're pioneering. We're getting into new ground. And it's very, 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 very exciting what we are doing here. That's why what we do here is so exciting, right? Trust me, I don't want to name names. I think you all know who I'm talking about. Multiple people that are putting out an anti-capitalist, anti-war, anti-imperialist message are watching what we do here and starting to sound, one day after another, more like us. You know who I'm talking about. I don't want to get into specifics, right? Don't want anyone to get offended. I'm not accusing anyone of plagiarism by any means. That is definitely not what I'm doing. In politics, they say that plagiarism is the greatest form of flattery. If you start talking one way politically and you start making one point and someone copies it and learns from your point, that's something you should celebrate, right? There's not intellectual property here. It's one thing if people are cutting and pasting your words into their articles, but if people are just learning the political points you're making, understanding the concepts that you're espousing, that's something to be happy about. That's not something to view in an individualist, kind of capitalistic way. No, it's the opposite. If you can have the influence to craft discourse and push discourse in a new direction, put new concepts into the paradigm, that's something to be proud of. That's very exciting, and we're doing that here. We really are doing it here. This book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, it's selling like crazy, folks. You wouldn't believe how many copies of this book are selling. It's not like anything I've written before, right? I still continue to sell copies every day. I get on there and more people have bought Getting Rich Without Capitalism. But it's not simply about the numbers, because the people that are buying City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, the people that are buying Getting Rich Without Capitalism, are moving on. These are influential people. These are people that are in the know. This is really, really exciting. I am really excited to be here. That's why I come on here with such confidence every Saturday or Sunday when I get on here, because we are doing stuff on here that hasn't been done before. We are, this is like being in a salon in the lead up to the French Revolution. No, we're not storming the Bastille, we're not beheading any kings, but this is like sitting in the salon with Voltaire, with Rousseau, and sitting there and hearing the ideas 2 or 3 decades before the French Revolution that laid the foundation, right? This is like being in London, in the coffee shop where Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin and Zinoviev were in exile and arguing about concepts like the party of a new type, right? This is more pivotal than the big moments, because it's conversations like this that make the big moments happen. You do realize there would have been no Bolshevik Revolution if there hadn't been a really discreet conversation of 5 or 6 people in London in a coffee shop where Lenin said to his fellow exiles, I got this brilliant idea. We'll start a vanguard party. And they're like, what do you mean a vanguard party? What are you talking about? There would have been no French Revolution if Voltaire and Rousseau and people like that hadn't been sitting in salons in France with other people saying, this third estate, the people, they could become a new government, right? We could get rid of, I'm just telling you, it's very, very exciting what we're doing here. We are on the vanguard. We are cutting edge. The conversations we are having here are going to have impact decades into the future. People are listening to us. Very important people are listening to us. And you can see that. And there are certain political tendencies that have noticed this, that, they start talking about things 2 or 3 decades ahead of time, and 20 years from now, everyone's talking about them. Neoliberalism. Think about that. I first heard the word neoliberalism from Noam Chomsky. When I was first getting into lefty politics shortly after 9/11, I got an audio recording of Noam Chomsky talking about Colombia. And it was an audio recording of Noam Chomsky, and he said neoliberalism. And I thought, what the hell is neoliberalism? Because I understood liberal to be political, like, there's liberals and conservatives. And I was perplexed. What in the world is neoliberalism? And he was describing free market economics, but I didn't know. I didn't know anything. But you have to remember, Chomsky knew about it. Other voices knew about neoliberalism. But the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein didn't come out till much later. David Harvey's history of neoliberalism didn't come out till much later. Some people were ahead of the game. And all the stuff that we associate with neoliberalism, like the 1990s in South America, like the 1990s in the Eastern Bloc, George Soros backing Jeffrey Sachs, all this stuff, while it was happening, certain people were tuned in enough to know that it was happening to decry it. But most people, and I was there, okay? I was a child. I wasn't as tuned into politics as I am now. But most people had no clue what was going on. Everyone thought in the USA in the 1990s that Russia was doing great. We all thought their economy was doing great, that they were so happy after the fall of the Soviet Union. The U.S. news media, whenever they discussed Russia, showed Boris Yeltsin and people cheering with Russian flags and Lenin statues being torn down. We had no effing clue what was going on. We had no idea that it was happening. Russia's population was declining by millions of people. People were dying in mass. Austerity, the constitutional crisis of 1993. We didn't have an effing clue. We had no idea. We had no idea it was going on. Some people did know what was going on and wrote about it and documented it, but they were on the vanguard. And then, a decade later, BBC is making a documentary about the fall of the Soviet Union. You have Naomi Klein's book coming out. You have David Harvey. You have all these voices. All of a sudden, there's an avalanche of criticism of neoliberalism. But that criticism came after the fact, and it was a response to the result of neoliberalism, and not the results in terms of people dying, the political fallout. Neoliberalism created Bolivarianism. Neoliberalism created Vladimir Putin. You couldn't have Bolivarian socialism if you hadn't had an ugly, ugly decade of neoliberal reforms all across South America. You could not have the Russian government as it is today if you had not had a decade of Yeltsin ugly reforms, right? That for every action there is a reaction, right? Nothing is constant in the universe. When we talk about contradictions, I remember when I first came around leftist organizations, they'd be like, the contradiction of the contradiction. Well, the contradictions. I see so many contradictions here playing out. And most of the people saying contradiction, contradiction, contradiction. I'm so smart, I can say contradiction, contradiction, contradiction. The contradictions of the contradictions. Most of the people using that word had no effing clue what they were talking about. They didn't. They didn't know what the word means. Well, what they're referring to is not the typical use of the word. Right? In everyday language, if your mother says, "Young man, you need to take out the garbage," and you say, "Mother, I do not need to take out the garbage," you are contradicting your mother, and that's disrespectful. You shouldn't do that, young child. But that's everyday language. That's what contradiction means in everyday discourse. But to Marxists, and not really Marxists, but to philosophers and those who understand Hegel and the dialectic, contradiction has a very different definition. Hegel argued in his concept of the dialectic that history is driven forward by clashes, things that cannot coexist, which he labeled as contradictions. And he explained that contradictions play themselves out like this. First, you have something. First, you have something. Of course you have something. Something. And then you have something that cannot coexist with it. So that first something becomes the thesis. And that second something that cannot coexist with it, it's contrary to the thesis, so it is an antithesis. And the thesis and the antithesis clash. They contradict each other because they cannot coexist. They are contradictory to each other. The thesis and the antithesis contradict each other. They clash. And out of that contradiction comes a synthesis. And the synthesis is brand new. It is not the thesis. It is not the antithesis. It is a totally new result that comes out of the contradiction. But eventually, this totally new thing becomes a thesis. And something arises that is contrary to it, that cannot coexist with it. Another antithesis arises. And again, you get another synthesis. And that synthesis becomes a thesis. And it is this ongoing thing. That is the concept of contradiction. That is what contradiction means. And it long predates Marx. This is Hegel. This is Hegel. Hegel saw contradiction as being with ideas. However, it was Marx who said that contradiction is actually driven by economics. Right? He believed in dialectical materialism and historical materialism, that it's economics and class struggles that drive these contradictions. It's not merely conflicts of ideas, that these ideas represent bigger social forces and social strata, right? That ideas don't exist in a vacuum. Friedrich Engels very famously said, thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, meaning that ideas don't just arise out of nowhere. Ideas are based in material reality. You have thoughts because you have this thing called a brain that thinks. And the thoughts you have are a reaction to the environment on which you are doing that thinking, in which you are observing things, right? That thought doesn't define reality. Reality defines thought. And that is a very big disagreement. That's idealism versus materialism. That's a whole nother conversation. But that's what's going on here, folks. New ideas are arising, contradictions are taking place. You know, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's all playing out before us. So now is the time that if you haven't tweeted this out and made this a bigger conversation, you need to do that. If you haven't pushed the like button, you also need to do that. If you haven't pushed the subscribe button, which I know 20% of you have not done so. So if you haven't pushed that subscribe button, you need to push the subscribe button. And now it's also time for me to do that thing where you all tell me who you are and where you're from, and I call you out one by one. So let's go. Who's there? I've seen some of you are here. Space Communist out in LA is with us. Jenny Lynn is with us. But start calling it out. Name and location. Let's do it. Maupin Time is here. Sami Jabber is here. Global Uprising says Kazuya. Robert, California. Hi, Tim, UK. Hello from Belgium, says Levon. Greetings from Georgia, says Nightshade. Upstate New York, Lucas Marshall. Jacob from Lafayette, Louisiana, Spain. Jason Dunn says, hello, friends. MMRED says, hello, Caleb from California. Jenny Lynn is in Ohio. Andre is from Italy. Rafael Mello is in Portugal. Christopher Semanchik is in Cleveland, Ohio. Graz is in Wisconsin. Monetizing Dissent is in Ireland. Kazuya is in Brooklyn. I'm in Brooklyn also. We ain't too far from each other. Adam Jensen says, wow, chat is exploding. Lawrence Chu is up in Albany, New York. Hello, Lawrence. Shout out to you. Kaname is in Maryland. Jared is in Phoenix. Ramiro is out in LA. He and Ophelia are shopping, and I'm their entertainment as they shop for groceries. Good for them. Carlos is in Mexico City. Harry says we need some Asians. Interesting observation. Western Austria says Bolshevik. Star says long live the Kentucky Workers Union. The inundation is in Indiana. Drunken Boatswain is in Russia. Alex Giovanni is not telling us where he's at. Arthur Porter says Bernie killed Rosa. Kazuya says the IMF must go. Names and locations, folks. Love you all. Comrades in the chat says Space Communist. And that's what we should all do. We should all love each other because this is a community. Pirate Alex is in Cleveland. Alex Giovanni is in Salem, Oregon. Neon Noir is talking about Rosa Luxemburg's course. Mark is in California. He's MRRED. Harry says it's a bad time for Oceania. Hades says talk about Walter Reuther. Fort Worth, Texas says marvelous. Hey, Caleb. Shout out to you. Matt Williams says Sacramento. Wow, we are getting going here, aren't we? This is great. This is a great little community. Kevin Castley. I don't know who that is. Is he watching, or is he someone I should stream with, or what's going on? Toronto, Canada, says Nathaniel P. Adams. From Australia, I assume that's what Oz means. Dylan is in Berkeley, California. Someone's in Utah who just got back from Vietnam. So, folks, JT24 is in Mississippi. Dan Pecker is in Pennsylvania. American Marxist is in San Angelo, Texas. Someone just said this chat is slamming, and I couldn't agree more. Folks, the president of Bolivia is Evo Morales. He won the election. There's absolutely no question that Evo Morales won the election. Evo Morales' poll approval ratings have been through the roof. The economy of Bolivia has been rising and rising and rising. All election observers agree that Evo Morales won the election. 47% of the vote. No one came anywhere close. Evo Morales has won the election in Bolivia. But you'll notice that mainstream U.S. media has a different opinion of that entire situation. Why is a phone ringing at my place? I don't know. I'm going to go and make sure that doesn't happen again. Sorry about that, folks. I don't know why. I have a landline, and someone decided to call it, and that was awkward and uncomfortable. But we were talking about Bolivia. Folks, let me just get you all back into place. We were talking about Bolivia. Evo Morales has won the elections in Bolivia. Evo Morales has won the elections in Bolivia. But U.S. media maintains that he has not won the elections in Bolivia. Couldn't possibly have happened. And despite the fact that polls showed that Evo Morales was going to win, it made sense that he was going to win because he's done so much for the economy. Friends, U.S. media insists that Evo Morales is a, quote, dictator. He is a, quote, dictator. And this, folks, leads me to a point that needs to be made, which is not that Evo Morales is not a dictator. I think that's pretty obvious to anyone who looks at the situation there. The point is, there will never be a socialist leader, an actually socialist leader, that Western capitalism will not accuse of being a brutal dictator. I am being absolutely real here. It will never happen. If a leader gets in and begins to change property relations and move the country toward socialism, U.S. media will call them a dictator. U.S. media will call them a dictator, no matter what. No matter what. There is no difference as far as the ruling classes of the United States and Western capitalism are concerned. There is no difference between Mao Zedong and Evo Morales, between Fidel Castro and Evo Morales, between President Xi in China and Evo Morales. If you take office and you start implementing socialism, you are a dictator. End of discussion. Evo Morales allows all kinds of opposition newspapers. In fact, I would say the majority of the voices in Bolivia are anti-Morales. The right wing has protests against Evo Morales. In fact, in the aftermath of the vote, they were trying to burn down voting places in order to prevent the votes from being counted. There are all kinds of anti-Morales people in the streets protesting, burning things, threatening people. They have the majority of the media. It's the same in Venezuela. I was in Venezuela during the 2015 elections in December for the parliament. Now, what did I see? Not for the parliament, the National Assembly. I saw advertisements on television for the opposition. I saw opposition protesters. I saw opposition people everywhere. They were openly stating their views. No one was ever afraid to be a member of the opposition. The opposition was openly tolerated. But in Venezuela, they haven't been able to overthrow the government. They haven't been able to remove the elected leadership. They haven't removed Maduro from office, so it's a dictatorship. Evo Morales is a dictator, and this is what I'm telling you, folks. I believe we're talking about Trotskyites. There are a lot of Trotskyites, not all Trotskyites, but what you could call neo-Trotskyists, who have it in their head that someday there will be this pure form of socialism that the New York Times will not accuse of being a dictatorship. And that is what they're willing to support. Right? They are for democracy. They don't support human rights violating Stalinist regimes. But they are convinced that one of these days there's going to be a socialism that is so democratic, so transparent, so open, so tolerant of the opposition, so loose in its legal and political system, so open, so benevolent that the New York Times will say, well, we don't agree with communism, but this is a legitimate regime. Wrong. Won't happen. Will not happen. About a year ago, I believe, maybe a little less than that, I read you an article from the New York Times about the attack on democracy. It wasn't the New York Times, it was the Wall Street Journal, in which it was argued that countries are not democratic when elected leaders alter the nature of institutions in the country, like businesses, like policing agencies, like universities, and all of that. So when elected leaders start to change the capitalist nature of society, it stops being democratic, even if that's what the majority of people want, even if the way these institutions functioned was to bow obediently before the West. It's not a democracy in their mind if we win. That's how they feel. It's not a democracy if we win. That's what you need to understand. Evo Morales has been the most open and accommodating and tolerant of opposition ever, but he is still a dictator. And they say all kinds of things about him that aren't true, and these people have tweeted at me, and they make things up. Right? They say the economy in Bolivia is just horrible. And I said, well, it's funny because the GDP growth for South America was the highest in Bolivia. No country had higher GDP growth than they did. Oh, that's all a big lie. I said, so the IMF is trying to cover up for a communist government? I'm not sure that's... No, it's all a big lie. It's all a big lie. They don't care. The allies of American capitalism, the voices representing American capitalism, do not care about the truth. A country is a dictatorship if capitalism is being tampered with. If capitalism is being overturned, if capitalist property relations are being changed, it becomes a dictatorship, no matter what. No matter how accommodating, no matter how friendly, no matter how open, no matter how democratic socialist it is, no matter how much they denounce Marxism, no matter how much of a market sector they have, no matter how much freedom of the press they have, no matter how much they tolerate the opposition, no matter how much they accommodate right-wing voices, it is a dictatorship if they don't win. And it's just important to recognize this. You know, we need to just recognize this. Everything that they have written about Evo Morales that is so obviously not true is in the same category as everything that they have written about the Soviet Union, about China. It doesn't matter. People say, oh, well, you know, the Soviet Union violated human rights. That's probably true, but does it matter? If it hadn't, they would have still said it did. It doesn't matter. It's not really about human rights. It's not about human rights. Not about human rights. It has nothing to do with what these leaders do. And this belief among neo-Trotskyites, among the people that follow Tony Cliff, Max Shachtman, that kind of thinking, that somehow we don't, and they always come at you with this very, very weird. They always say, well, the reason they don't support any existing socialist society is because I don't want workers to think that's what I want to create. I don't want people to think that when we're aiming to build socialism, this society like Bolivia or like modern China is what we're trying to create. I want something more beautiful and free than that. And here's what you're missing, folks. If something that was more beautiful and free would come into existence, they would still call it a brutal dictatorship. And they would still have documentaries on television saying it was hell on earth. You will never get the approval of Western capitalism's human rights voices. You will never get the New York Times to say, well, we don't agree with it, but it's a... No. Won't happen. Will not happen. They will never approve of an existing socialist society. So trying to accommodate these viewpoints, and I know a lot of people do this, they're convinced, well, if I disassociate myself, no. It's the sooner you come to understand that they don't really care about human rights, they align with brutal human rights violating regimes that they themselves admit violate human rights all the time, like the Saudi monarchy, all kinds of regimes all over the world they have no problem with, that are corrupt, that execute dissidents, that do all kinds of horrendous things, that, they have no problem with it. Look at the national security laws of South Korea. Look at the Philippines and what was done under the Marcos regime. Look at the genocide in Indonesia after the CIA toppled the elected leader. they don't care about human rights. They don't care about human rights. And no matter how open and accommodating socialist leaders are, no matter how friendly and democratic, no matter how tolerant they are, they still call it a brutal dictatorship. As far as they are concerned, Evo Morales is just like Mao, he's just like Stalin, he's just like Fidel Castro. Doesn't matter. I'm probably repeating myself, but I just have had so many instances where I meet people that fall under the illusion that somehow this stuff matters, and they don't get it. And until you are willing to recognize that it does not matter what they do, until you are willing to recognize that, you are going to be in a trap. You're going to be in a trap. I'm just telling you. You're going to be in a trap. Evo Morales has done amazing things for Bolivia. He has built huge numbers of roads all throughout the country. He has wiped out illiteracy in Bolivia. He has provided dental care to low-income people. He has provided all kinds of medical care with Cuban doctors all over Bolivia. He has raised the GDP very significantly. And there was an interview by his vice president, who eventually, Evo Morales, will retire, and this guy will probably be the person that the socialist movement wants to replace him. He did an interview with CNN in Spanish, and he said the reason we have economic growth is because the state controls the major centers of economic power. He said that. So this is a very good interview with CNN in Espanol. Very, very good interview. And he said the reason that we are having economic growth is because we have socialism. The results are phenomenal. And the same for Nicaragua. Their economic results have been phenomenal. They've raised all kinds of people out of poverty. Now, Venezuela is having its difficulties. We know about that. The difficulties, are mainly based on the fact that it's an oil-centered economy, and also mainly based on the fact that the imperialists are doing everything they can to sabotage their economy and prevent them from having dollars and prevent food from being shipped in, and they have big problems. But those problems are not caused by socialism, and they continue to have improved people's lives. And I was in Venezuela. I saw from my very own eyes how much they have improved the lives of the people in Venezuela. In terms of, again, wiping out illiteracy, building all kinds of infrastructure, providing people with health care. I walked through a neighborhood in central Caracas where every single house had been built with an interest-free loan provided by the government. And prior to that, in the 1990s, under neoliberalism, these people had lived in shacks made out of wood, with no running water, with no electricity. My friend Dakota Lilly, a longtime friend of mine, who went on Fox News to defend Venezuela against Tucker Carlson's deceptions, he just got back from Venezuela this week. He was there earlier this week. He just got back. So we did a chat on Skype last night. I'm editing it, putting in some graphics. It'll be up on the internet very shortly. We need to get beyond this illusion that somehow we're going to have a capitalism, or we're going to have a socialist society that the imperialists and capitalists will tolerate, that they won't smear with lies, that they'll approve of. It won't happen. It won't happen, folks. It just won't happen. Yes, someone is drilling in the background. There's construction going on at the apartment building across the hall. Nothing I can do about it. And I do appreciate all of you who are concerned about my health. I have my addiction to a certain diet soda, as I see people mentioning there, and it's not healthy. And I realize that. And it's better to be addicted to this than something else. But I know I have the proclivity. I like the caffeine rush. I am. If anyone knows me, they say I'm a type A personality. I am go, 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 go. And I like that caffeine. I know that this is an aspect of my personality, and so I've made a big point of avoiding energy drinks. I don't drink energy drinks. I definitely don't use cocaine. I definitely don't use Adderall, because I know my proclivities of personality. Someone was describing the personality of Sherlock Holmes in the Arthur Conan Doyle novels, and how he's kind of tired, and then all of a sudden he's getting in the case and he's, rushing and he's, shooting up cocaine and all of that. I've never used cocaine. I've never used any illegal substance. But I like that rush. I have that personality, and that's why I've been warned. And I've been warned by other people, and that's why I'm very careful to limit it to this. This is my upper addiction. I don't like coffee. Never developed a taste for it. Good. Very, very good. There are times where I can't get a Diet Coke, and I'll have a shot of espresso, and the taste is awful, but it gives me the caffeine that I'm addicted to, right? And, it's a reality. And I realize that it's not healthy, folks. I really do. And the thing is drinking this beverage that will not be named better for you than drinking? Is it better for you than smoking? Maybe. Maybe not. I mean, we don't know all the dangerous health effects associated with this. We don't know. We know that smoking causes cancer. I don't smoke. There you go. But this could be worse for you. I'm not ruling out that this could be worse for you than smoking cigarettes, right? We know that, drinking too much of it is linked to a lot of health problems. And trust me, folks, I realize that. And, there's a lot of things people do that are not good. And I realize that. And I thank you all for loving me enough to be concerned about my health. Really, I deeply care about you. And I really do appreciate it. I will say, I'm just throwing this out here. Not a defense of my unhealthy habit at all. But I'll throw this out there. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, according to CNN, drinks 12 cans of Diet Coke every single day. I usually drink 4 or 5. And Donald Trump, not only has Donald Trump not died from his liver exploding, but he also is president of the United States. So he's been quite successful. So that makes me think maybe it's not so bad. I was overjoyed, mind you. I don't know if folks remember, that day there was a bombing in Manhattan. There was some terrorist and he tried to blow up his pants or something, and it was a whole thing. So I was on location, reporting on this terrorist incident, and CNN... Everyone made fun of CNN. Everyone made fun of CNN. They couldn't believe that CNN, after covering the terrorist incident for an hour or two, said, and now back to our lead story, Donald Trump drinks way too much diet soda. And everyone made fun of them because that's CNN. That's what they terrorist attack or scandal about the president's choice of beverage. And everyone made fun of them about how ridiculous that was. And that's CNN, right? Anything they can have. But, it made me think. When I saw that, I was like, well, that's the best news I've heard all day. The fact that he drinks 12 bottles of Diet Coke every day. Well, there you go. But anyway, folks, enough about this. I don't want to make this the topic of conversation. And who knows, one day maybe I'll come on here and I'll say, I've given it up. I'm no longer drinking a caffeinated beverage. And you can all cheer for me and we can all move on. That day won't be happening very often, very time soon, but enjoy in looking forward to it. Be optimistic. I always try to be optimistic about the future. Better I'm drinking this than alcohol, right? If I were on here drunk out of my mind, if I were, that wouldn't be good. But there you go. What is it? Somebody used to joke about how at AA meetings, right? If you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, which I've never been to, they say it's weird. All these people are talking about why you shouldn't drink alcohol, and they're all smoking cigarettes like crazy, and they're all drinking coffee like crazy. Well, they got to be addicted to something, right? And people consider being a cigarette smoker or being a user of caffeine. People consider that to be a benign addiction. Now, is that fair? No, probably not, right? And is this better for you than marijuana? I'd hope so for me, but maybe it's not. I am not a scientist, and there's probably people that would argue that it isn't, right? People have widely documented that the tolerance for alcohol versus the intolerance of marijuana is very hypocritical. That alcohol, in terms of use, in terms of the effects it has on people, is far more dangerous than marijuana. I don't use either of them, but that's a truth that people have recognized, that the tolerance for alcohol and the stigma around marijuana is hypocritical on the part of our society. Many people have made that point. I made that point when I was a youngster in school, having to endure the awful don't do drugs education. And, you know, they had a point. And hypocrisy is not something people enjoy, is it? Right? Is it something people have a toleration for? Hypocrisy. No one likes hypocrisy. What else is on your mind, folks? What else do you want me to talk about? I've got a few topics I want to get into, but I want to hear from you all. Why don't I jump into this? America can't escape the Middle East, says the Wall Street Journal. America cannot escape the Middle East. America can't escape the Middle East. Do you folks remember when energy independence was the favorite talking point of every liberal? Energy independence. Energy independence. The idea was, and this was especially in the Gulf War era, Gulf War up into the 90s, the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the talking point of many liberals was that the reason that the USA is constantly involved in affairs in the Middle East is because we need their oil. And so if we could establish energy independence, we could get out of the Middle East. We wouldn't have to have wars in the Middle East anymore. We wouldn't have to be involved in stuff over there because we would have energy independence. One of the first tiny little Iraq War rallies I went to in a college town that was very close to the town I grew up in was 5 or 6 Quakers standing there with candles. And then there was, at one of these rallies, a solar power enthusiast who came with a sign that says oil, and he had like a chant that he had us all do. It was very long and complicated. Kind of a nerdy fellow, I think. He was like an engineer, worked somewhere around there, and he had a sign that said, like, oil causes wars, solar is the way out, and he had us all, like, chant in unison this very long, complicated, the cause of wars is oil, soil. It was kind of adorable in a way. And it was good this guy was protesting the war, because most people that opposed the war wouldn't protest it, which is something I'll get to later. I'll get to that later. But, and that was widely believed. I remember, when they talk about architecture, they had underground houses that were like dugouts, that were like underground. That was a new idea that people had at one point. And there was all these ideas that if we could be more environmental, we could use less oil, or if we could transition away from fossil fuels, we would not have to have these wars. We could have energy independence, the dependence on foreign oil. The dependence on foreign oil was the source of the U.S. military involvement in the Middle East. In fact, I had a teacher who I particularly did not like in high school who really believed this. And he after 9/11, was passing out a list of companies. And I mean, I look back on it now, whatever. But he had a list of gas stations you should buy from that didn't import from the Middle East, that imported from like Nigeria or Venezuela. And it was funny because Venezuela, socialism or whatever, but his idea was that we're buying Muslim oil and then we're contributing to the problem. And of course, Islamophobia, hate, and all of that, but we need to stop buying Muslim oil. That was his talking point. This guy was very anti-Islamic and very racist, but he considered himself to be this big environmentalist, so he was passing out lists of everyone at the school, photocopied something that an email had gone out, don't buy Muslim oil. That was his talking point. Folks, we have energy independence. We have energy independence. We have achieved energy independence. The USA now exports oil. The 1973 oil export ban passed by Congress during the OPEC boycott, in which there were big lines at all the gas stations, has been lifted. And it's not just Texas oil and Louisiana oil. We got fracking. 2013, 2014 was about the time where the United States became the world's largest oil and gas producer. We produce more natural gas and oil in the United States than any other country in the world. That happened under Obama. It happened under the Democrats. So it's kind of hilarious when Trump gets up there and says, I made America the biggest oil producer, bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than China, bigger than the Soviet Union. It's like, well, it was kind of like that since 2014. It's just Obama was more of an environmental guy, so he didn't want to brag about it. But energy independence has been achieved. We are exporting our oil and gas. We're still importing it, sure. And that makes 0 sense, but that's capitalism. But if Saudi Arabia were to stop sending us oil, if Qatar and Kuwait and Oman were to stop sending us oil, we'd be all right. We'd be fine. It would impact the price of oil for sure. We'd have to rearrange things. It would cause a bit of a scramble, but would we have people, around the block desperate for gasoline? Would it be the 1973 oil OPEC boycott? No. We have energy independence. We have achieved energy independence. But right now we have U.S. troops in Iraq. We have a few U.S. troops remaining in Syria. We have U.S. troops now in Saudi Arabia. We have U.S. troops in Libya. We have U.S. troops in Somalia. We have U.S. troops all over the Middle East. We have U.S. troops in Bahrain. We are all over the Middle East. We have troops in Afghanistan. So if the issue was energy independence, why are we still there? Because the fight isn't over oil itself. It's about control of the oil markets. It's about the profits of big oil companies. They still have oil in the Middle East. We have oil, sure, but Iraq still has oil. Iran still has oil. Saudi Arabia still has lots of oil. Bahrain still has oil. Qatar still has oil. Kuwait still has oil. And we, not you and me, but they, I should say, Wall Street, the Pentagon, the big international banks and corporations that rule the world, want to maximize their profits, and they don't like competitors. And that has not changed. It's not about energy independence. It is about monopolies. It is about monopolism. It's about imperialism. And no, imperialism is not a synonym for military intervention. Imperialism is a system. It is a system. It is a global economic order in which a small group of bankers based in the United States and Western Europe dominate the world economy and rake in super profits by keeping the world poor. And how, mind you, do they keep the world poor? Well, when there is a country like Iraq that has a Ba'ath Arab socialist revolution and starts seizing control of its own oil and selling its oil on the markets in competition with ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron, what does the United States do? The United States invades Iraq, blows it to smithereens, blows it off the market, and then everyone who was buying their oil from Iraq has to buy it from us. When there is a country like Libya that has an Islamic socialist revolution and is using its oil, selling its oil on the international markets, exporting oil, using the profits to build the world's biggest irrigation system, to wipe out illiteracy in the country, to build infrastructure, what do? They back and fund oppositionists to the government. They then go in with NATO bombs, and they bomb and destroy Libya, and they blow it to bits so that Libya exports roughly 10% of the amount of oil it exported under Gaddafi. And so this big, huge state-run competitor is no longer on the markets, and all the people that were buying their oil from Libya now buy it from us, from Wall Street in London. When there's a country like Russia that nationalized its oil and gas, that has restructured its economy around Gazprom and Rosneft, two giant state-controlled megacorporations, we put sanctions on them, we isolate them, we put pressure on anyone who wants to do business and trade with them, twisting people's arms in Europe, demanding that Germany and other countries not cooperate with the oil pipelines they're building, with the natural gas pipelines they're building, do everything we can to push them off the market so that people buy from us and not from them. This is imperialism. Imperialism is a global economic order. That's what imperialism is. That is what imperialism is. And the reason that America can't seem to get out of the Middle East is because the imperialist global order is still intact. The world should be their captive market as far as they are concerned. The Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Rothschilds, Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, HSBC Bank, JP Morgan Chase, the Gettys. They want the world as their impoverished, dependent, captive market. And this is what imperialism is. And as long as this global system is intact, this is what we are going to deal with. And there is going to be, and especially in places where there is oil, places like Venezuela, places like Nigeria, places like the Middle East, places where there's oil, the U.S. is going to be heavily involved in trying to make sure that it maintains its monopoly. And instability in those regions is very, very strategic. Think about that. Keeping those countries at each other's throats, keeping those countries underdeveloped, keeping those countries poor. Angola. Angola is an oil-rich country in southern Africa. And the people of Angola resisted Portuguese colonialism after they won their independence. I mean, there was like kind of a revolution in Portugal. After they established their independence, the Soviet-aligned MPLA, Socialist Marxist Party, came to power, and the United States backed UNITA, that claimed they were Maoists. In the 80s, they stopped claiming to be Maoists and admitted that they were Jeffersonian Christians or whatever. But this was a vile terrorist organization. From 1975 to 2002, Angola was subject to civil war because the United States backed and funded UNITA. Read about UNITA, this armed terrorist group in Angola backed by the United States. It was led by Jonas Savimbi. Jonas Savimbi. And Jonas Savimbi was a vile, vile man. Read about Jonas Savimbi. He was a literal cannibal. He was a mass murderer and a killer. The USA backed, armed, and trained this murderous, plundering, primitive killer in Angola and kept Angola in a state of civil war for decades to keep this wealthy, oil-rich country in Africa in a state of poverty and instability. And BP kept buying their oil. And from 2002 onward, Angola has had very big rates of economic growth. They finally had peace in 2002 after this monster, Jonas Savimbi, was killed. After he died, they said Angola starts now, and they had huge rates of economic growth. They've been working closely with China. But think about that. A country was kept in a state of chronic civil war. Read for yourself about the monster, Jonas Savimbi. Read about him. That's who the USA was backing. That's who Britain was backing. That's who the West was arming and supporting in order to keep this oil-rich country from developing and becoming a strong socialist country. This is how they operate. This is how imperialism functions. Imperialism is not about development. It's not about going to these countries and helping these people to modernize. No. It's about going to these countries and making sure these people do not modernize, keeping them poor. That's what imperialism is. That's what imperialism is, folks. Now, there's a couple other things I wanted to talk about while we're here today. I've always got plenty on my mind. I had an interesting argument on Twitter the other day. And if those of you who don't follow me on Twitter, now is the time to go follow me on Twitter, Caleb Maupin. I'm the only one, at Caleb Maupin, all one word. And I've had some interesting arguments with people. One man that I just cannot stand is Dinesh D'Souza. Can't stand Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh D'Souza is a right-wing Fox News commentator. And he's basically a professional historical revisionist. Dinesh D'Souza, very famously, for example, Dinesh D'Souza, he made this film, Hillary's America. He made a film like America, what it's all about. I mean, his whole line is that, the Democrats are bad because they are, I summed it up. I love to sum up his work. The Democrats are bad because they're racist, because they're Marxist, just like Hitler. That's basically the thesis of his writing. The Democrats are bad because they're racists, because they're Marxists, just like Hitler. Now, if you know anything about history, you'll know there are a lot of problems with that. First of all, the Democrats are racist because they're Marxists. Karl Marx was a backer of the Republican Party. Right? And I've tweeted this. Dinesh D'Souza knows this. He just doesn't acknowledge this. Karl Marx was a big supporter of Abraham Lincoln. So citing statements made by the Democrats when they were the party of the plantation system of the South, of the Jim Crow South, and blaming it on Marxism is completely idiotic. It is completely asinine. Karl Marx worked for the New York Tribune newspaper, the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. That was one of Karl Marx's only jobs he had in his life, was working for the New York Tribune. Karl Marx spoke of Abraham Lincoln in glowing language. He said that the American Civil War was the Second American Revolution. Read the letter that Marx wrote on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, congratulating Abraham Lincoln for the 1864 election. The Marxists in the United States loved the Republican Party in the 1860s, not the Democratic Party. Karl Marx and the Marxists were against slavery, they were against the Democratic Party, and they were closely tied to the Republican Party. That's a historical fact. In fact, there is a brigadier general in the Union Army by the name of August Willich. And August Willich fought for the Union Army. He was a Republican, and he corresponded with Karl Marx all throughout the war. And he openly professed his communist and Marxist views within the military, within the Union Army. trying to give the impression that the Democrats of the era of slavery or the Democrats of the era of Jim Crow were Marxists is a huge distortion of reality. It is. I mean, it's just... I mean, maybe you should start telling your audience the earth is flat. Maybe you should start telling the audience that, Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny are Republicans. I mean, is he correct in pointing out the Democrats were a party of racism historically? No, not at all. Is he completely out of his mind when he tries to blame that on Marxism? Yes, he is. In the 1930s, the Communist Party was organizing for the rights of the Scottsboro Nine, calling for an end to Jim Crow long before it was popular. The Communist Party positioned itself as the champion of African American rights. And, you might think, okay, Dinesh D'Souza, he's just ignorant. He's just ignorant. He doesn't know what he's saying. Oh, no. Oh, no. First of all, Dinesh D'Souza has gone to Ivy League schools. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily, in my experience, there are a lot of people who have really highfalutin resumes and are really not that smart. But first, you have to know something. But recently, Dinesh D'Souza, in order to defend Donald Trump around the issue of using the word lynch, he cited this book, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, by Eric Foner. This is a history of the Republican Party. The Ideology of the Republican Party Before the Civil War, by Eric Foner. It's a great book. And Eric Foner is a Marxist. He comes from a Marxist family. His uncle was Philip S. Foner, who was one of the main labor historians of the Communist Party USA. This is a great book. And he cited it on the air in order to make a point that Democratic Party of the Jim Crow era used lynching, which is a fact. But so he knows what's in this book. And he knows that when he tries to say that the Democratic Party of the Jim Crow era was left-wing and that somehow Marxists are responsible for racism, he knows he's lying because he's read this book. He's consciously lying. And I'm annoyed by it because I care about the history of Marxism. And I don't like seeing it distorted. But I care about it, but I think his audience should care about it because they're being lied to. They look like fools. And I don't know how many, I'll tweet at Dinesh what I just said, and I'll get his audience tweeting back at me, no, you're retarded, you're stupid. And I'll prove to them with a few tweets that Karl Marx was a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, that the Marxists were aligned with the Republicans, and they'll look like idiots. Because they're being conned. I believe, in his heart of hearts, Dinesh D'Souza doesn't believe what he's saying. He hates his audience. I would debate Dinesh anytime. You set it up, Naveen, I'll do it. He hates his audience. He knows how ignorant his audience is. And he hates them. And he sees them as mooches and suckers and stupid people he can hustle and take advantage of. He knows how illogical his arguments are, and he doesn't care. And then, of course, me pointing out that the Democrats are racist because they're Marxists. Well, no, in the era when the Democrats were racist, they were not Marxist, and he knows that. That leads to the next point, which is they're Marxists just like Hitler. Folks, Adolf Hitler hated Marxism. And immediately they go, yeah, but it's National Socialist Party. The Nazis, in their rhetoric, in their propaganda, were very critical of capitalism. That is factually accurate. However, the Nazis hated Marxism. And if you read a certain book called Mein Kampf, there's no question about that. No question at all. in Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler spends pages and pages talking about how much he hates Marxism, how much Marxism is responsible for World War I being lost by Germany, how Marxists, quote, stabbed Germany in the back and caused them to lose the war. I mean, if you read Mein Kampf, there is no question about how much Hitler hated Marxism and how much his National Socialism was a movement of opposition to Marxism. And then you get people on social media who will say, yeah, okay, maybe he was against Marxism, but National Socialism is just another form of socialism, therefore Hitler was on the left. Well, Hitler didn't think he was on the left. He didn't. There was a book, you read Hitler's writings. They called themselves the Party of the Right. The Party of the Right. They referred to themselves as a Party of the Right. However, and this is where it gets interesting, they didn't believe in free markets. The blind adherence to free markets, the belief that the free market capitalism is an absolute necessity, that's a very new belief among American right-wingers. It's very new. The right-wing belief that capitalism and free markets are sacred is very new. And that's where folks don't, you got to realize that politics is a lot bigger. Have you folks ever heard of the Scopes monkey trial? The Scopes monkey trial of 1927, I believe. Very famous incident in American history. You had John Scopes, who was a high school teacher in Kentucky, in Dayton, Kentucky, who taught evolution, Darwinian evolution, to his class, and was arrested because that violated the law in Kentucky. It was illegal to teach Darwin's evolution. 1925, someone's pointing out. It was illegal to teach Darwin's evolution. So he was arrested, put on trial for teaching evolution, and it was a very famous case. They called it the monkey trial, and it was a media firestorm. And representing Mr. John Scopes was Clarence Darrow, the left-wing attorney who had defended Eugene Debs, who was associated with socialists and labor unions. Clarence Darrow. But who was the right-winger? Who was the conservative? Who was the one defending biblical creationism, who wanted Darwinian evolution to be outlawed? Who was it? Who was the attorney, the very famous American attorney who prosecuted John Scopes? He was a Democrat, because back then Democrats were quite conservative. Roosevelt turnover hadn't happened. He was a Democrat named William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan had been a populist, and he had led the populists, as they were becoming more racist, to merge into the Democratic Party. And William Jennings Bryan, his main argument, and people forget this, his main argument in favor of creationism was that Darwinian evolution opened the door to capitalism and to free market, unregulated capitalism. He argued that survival of the fittest, allowed people to be exploited and paid low wages. He argued that if you got rid of the Bible and if you believed in Darwinian evolution, you were opening the door to crazy free market exploitation of people. William Jennings Bryan was associated with the labor unions, the early labor unions, and he was associated with efforts to outlaw child labor, right? William Jennings Bryan was a conservative, and he was one of the old school conservatives, people that were like the feudal folks, people that thought capitalism was bad and we needed to go back to a traditional society. And as a creationist, and as a conservative who wanted alcohol to be remaining illegal under prohibition, as a conservative who wanted, he was quite critical of the free market. William Jennings Bryan was a right-winger. He was a conservative. But being a conservative at one point did not mean you believed in free market, unregulated capitalism. It meant you believed in traditional hierarchy. It means you believed in authority. It means you wanted to uphold societal institutions. The worship of free markets among conservatives is very new and it's very manufactured. Right-wingers have always hated Marxism. They've associated Marxism with revolution, with tearing down, old social institutions, with radicalism. But the father of European conservatism, Oswald Spengler, right, the writer who wrote The Decline of the West, that gave birth to what eventually became the fascist movements of Europe, doesn't like capitalism. Because capitalism's too open, too free. It's not following rules. Conservatism as a movement is about reinforcing and protecting hierarchical structures and traditions. That's what conservatism as a movement is. It just so happens in the United States, since, the 1920s and 30s, free market capitalism has been the institution, the hierarchical institution that they have decided to defend. But during the time of the French Revolution, right, that's where the term right-wing comes from, the French Revolution. Afterwards, the National Assembly is formed. The people who are the most radical sit on the left, and those who are conservative and don't believe in the curses and the oaths and the insults of the king, they sit on the right. I talk about this in City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. And left and right, the difference was the left did not uphold the traditions of the feudal French society, and the right did. They opposed the oaths and indecencies of those sitting on the left. That is the difference between left and right. And the European right, like Hitler, like Oswald Spengler, like Julius Evola, they were critical of capitalism because they saw capitalism as leading to violations of tradition. Right-wing anti-capitalism exists. I think probably the greatest example of, quote, right-wing anti-capitalism today is Tucker Carlson. Read Tucker Carlson's book, The Ship of Fools. He openly says the right wing needs to get over its love affair with capitalism, and that there is a conservative right-wing critique of capitalism. There is a belief that capitalism encourages people to not follow rules, encourages a society where there's not a solid social structure. You don't have to be left-wing to be critical of capitalism. There are plenty of people who believe in authority, who believe in suppressing people, who believe that historical progress is bad, who believe that people should be oppressed, who believe that there should be no effort to correct injustice in society, who don't like capitalism. In fact, if you really want to understand what it means to be right-wing, you ought to read a children's book. There's a certain children's book published in 1933, the same year that Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany. There's a children's book that explains the essence of what right-wing is. It's called The Story About Ping. It's a children's book written by a German-American woman in Long Island in 1933. And it's a favorite. Captain Kangaroo, he read it to kids on TV for years. The Story About Ping. This is a children's book that explains right-wing ideology in ways that Julius Evola, the ideologue of Italian fascism, of German Nazism, beloved by the alt-right today, Julius Evola would love this book, The Story About Ping. It's a children's book about a little duck named Ping, and I'm not even going to get into it. Go and read it for yourself. If you want to know what right-wing is, that's that book. The message of the story is tampering with existing social hierarchies makes things worse. That's basically the message of the book. Challenging authority, tampering with traditional social hierarchies, trying to resist in perceived injustice only makes things worse, and that we need to get back to the traditional way. That's what a right-wing belief is. Now, that does not mean you don't believe in capitalism necessarily. That's what those who are defenders of capitalism tend to believe, right? Giving people free healthcare only makes things worse. Taxing the rich only makes things worse. Trying to have socialism only makes things worse. We need to leave things as they are. The rich are rich because of capitalism, the poor are poor, and if you tamper with that, that makes things worse. That is conservatism. That trying to create a more just world will only make things worse. That's what it means to be right-wing. The right wing in the French Parliament said overthrowing, in the French National Assembly during the French Revolution said trying to overthrow the king is only going to make things worse. The right wing in Nazi Germany said these Marxists that have formed labor unions, that are always out in the street protesting, they're trying to tear apart the traditions of German society. They're only trying to make things worse. Conservatives today in the United States that say you want to make reforms, you want, gay marriage, and you want people, to be able to have free health care, you're only going to make things worse. That's the essence of conservatism. Conservatism is a belief in trying to defend and uphold traditional conservative structures in society, defending traditional hierarchies. In the United States, in 2019, that means that you are a defender of capitalism. But it does not always mean that. And if you're a social conservative, if your focus is on things like gay marriage and pornography, you might be quite critical. You would want to outlaw pornographic bookstores. You would want to regulate what's on TV. You wouldn't believe in it's complicated. But the libertarian economic notions do not have a monopoly on right wing, and that point must be made. And that's why Hitler was not left wing. Hitler hated leftists. Hitler hated socialists. Hitler hated Marxism because he was right wing, and he saw in his rhetoric, I shouldn't say he saw, but in a lot of his rhetoric, he was critical of the free market, and he was critical of free market policies because he saw it leading to an uncontrolled society. Hitler implemented Shaktian economics, which everyone wants me to do a talk on, and I think I may do an educational talk on Shaktian economics. There's actually a great book, and I've got it right behind me here. This is a biography of the Nazi economist, Hjalmar Schacht. If you want to know what the Nazis believed in economically, you got to read about Hjalmar Schacht, and I talked about it in my recent lecture out in LA, and I've talked about it before, and Shaktian economics is the basis of what the Nazis did economically. It wasn't, to be fair, it wasn't unregulated capitalism. It wasn't Ludwig von Mises. It was attempts of the government to control the economy by putting people in prison, by putting people in concentration camps, by having huge amounts of government spending on military, and it was a form of Keynesian economics. It was military prison industrial complex, military industrial complex economics. It was government spending, beating down and impoverishing certain sections of the population. You want to understand what Nazi economics is about, learn about Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht, Shaktian economics, was what the Nazis believed in. It's not totally unregulated free market capitalism, but it's capitalism. It's definitely capitalism. There's lots of big corporations making profits. There's lots of workers being exploited. There's lots of rule of the invisible hand. There's a means of production operating according to profits. It's capitalism. It ain't socialism, that's for sure. It's not socialism. But, is it, oh boy. Is it something out of an Ayn Rand novel? No. But what's interesting is Ayn Rand herself was an advocate of that kind of thing at one point in her life. I bet you didn't know that the first big political act of Ayn Rand was during the Second World War. She composed a poster, a broadsheet. That was an old thing back in the day that had posters that were very big and had a lot of words on them. And it was called To All Innocent Fifth Columnists. Fifth columnists. That was during the Second World War. What was a fifth columnist? That was a pro-fascist within an anti-fascist country. The fifth column. It comes from the Spanish Civil War. Franco, he had 4 columns that were going to attack Madrid. And he said, well, I have a 5th column inside. I mean, traitorous people, within the democratic country. The 5th column. Ayn Rand considered herself very openly during the Second World War to be a 5th columnist. And Ayn Rand's early writings did denounce capitalism. People, she did her best to cover that up and obscure that. But in the late 30s, during the Second World War, Ayn Rand was very critical of capitalism, and she had more or less pro-fascist views. That's a fact. And a lot of the people who eventually became advocates of, the Montpellier Society, Ludwig von Mises, a lot of them did have pro-fascist views, in the Second World War. If you read what was written by the Austrian economists, they did not agree with the economics of Mussolini. They did not agree with the economics of Hitler, but they thought, thank God they're killing all the commies. And they said it. They blatantly said it. And my lecture on neoliberalism, which is available online, one of my more popular talks, goes into great detail about that. The Austrian school, yes, they didn't have fascist economic ideas, but they liked the Nazis. They liked the fascists because they killed Reds, right? And that's the attitude of a lot of these libertarian types. They tell you they believe in freedom, and then they're sharing those helicopter memes of communists being thrown out of helicopters, and they think Pinochet murdering all kinds of people for their political beliefs and overthrowing an elected government is great. And I've spent a lot of time talking about that. It needs to be said that those who believe in free market economics, they would prefer a violent dictatorship that kills communists over a free society where communists were free to get elected. And that's a fact that needs to be made. But yeah, folks, I've talked about all of this before, but that point needs to be raised, and that I had another person, in addition to Dinesh D'Souza's distortion that somehow the Democrats of Lincoln's age were Marxists when the Marxist movement was supporting the Republicans, was very enthusiastic about abolishing slavery. I've had many people, in addition to that, who've tried to tell me that Hitler was left-wing, and that is factually not accurate either. But in order to do that, you have to understand what the real difference between left and right is. And you have to think beyond the shallow debate that we have now, right? But enough said about that. What else is on people's minds? Anything else people want to chat about? I'm having a great time. I've got plenty of diet beverage. We could go much longer than this. I'm having a great time. We're chattering away here. What else is on people's minds? Why are all these folks in the streets all of a sudden? Hong Kong's been going on for a while. Efforts to bring down the government of Venezuela have been going on for a while, but now it's exploding, right? We got the anti-Morales folks in Bolivia. We got the Chilean people rising up against neoliberalism, right? The economics of free market policies of neoliberalism have been such a disaster in Chile that people are out in the streets in huge numbers rebelling. In Argentina, they are on the verge of re-electing the left-wing populist government, the Kirchners and the social, anti-imperialist forces are on the verge of winning. George Lucas said Soviet filmmakers had more freedom than Americans, says Neon Noir. Very interesting, and I have heard that before. George Lucas talked about how in the Soviet Union, you weren't allowed to make movies that were critical of socialism or anti-communist, but beyond that, you had a lot of freedom, whereas in America, and you'd sit down with the people paying for the movie, and you negotiate constantly, and advertisers and all of that. Very good point, Neon Noir. Very, very good point. That point has been made. Very good point, and thank you for the super chat. And people forget how much, art, it's supposedly so free, but you got to pay for it. Someone's got to pay for it. In the Soviet Union, they cut a check to the film director and said, go and make a movie that'll help the Soviet Union. If he was going to make a movie that was anti-communist or would encourage dissidents, they weren't going to tolerate that. And why should they pay for it, right? I mean, it's the Soviet government's paying for it. But at the same time, beyond that, they had more freedom. So, and it's complicated. People seem to forget that art and culture is very much controlled by the people footing the bill. If you study art history, that's a reality. I mean, that's a big reality if you study art history. The bill is being footed. There's patrons, they call them. Patrons, people that pay artists, and they have a lot to say. Patreon, I think the name of Patreon comes from that, but it's true. Artists, directors, painters, Shakespeare, the playwright. I think Shakespeare's patron was, was it Gordon Pine? Was that the name? But yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, they say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And that's a reality. And if the state is the piper in a socialist society where the government is funding art. The state, calls the tune, whereas in Western society, the billionaires and bankers who own Hollywood call the tune. Now, there's also government involvement, and people forget that, right? The CIA, subsidizes and all that. The military intelligence agencies have sponsored movies, and they do PR as well, and there's a whole history of that. But it's not as simple as people make it out. People make it out. Artists in the West can just do whatever they want, and artists in the socialist countries are controlled by the state. Well, the state tends to have a looser hand than patrons do, and that's what makes all of this a little bit complicated. Does that mean I'm defending necessarily saying that the censorship in the Soviet Union was good? Maybe it wasn't. But there's a strong argument for it, which is, if a patron's argument is going to be, well, hey, if I'm paying you to paint pictures, I am not going to pay you to paint pictures I politically disagree with. We all know about how the Rockefellers famously tore down Diego Rivera's mural. Remember that? Diego Rivera, a Trotskyite, not a legitimate communist. Diego Rivera, the painter, who did some socialist and progressive painting. There's like a painting in Detroit that's pretty nice that he did. Diego Rivera was hired by Rockefeller Center to make a big mural, to paint this big mural. And in the mural, he had Lenin and Trotsky. And so the Rockefellers tore it down. Jackhammers, brrr, they tore it down. Why? Because they were paying for it. That tends to be how these things work. So why, if the Soviet government is paying for it, should they sponsor films that are going to cause dissent? It's a fair argument for their censorship. It's not simply the authoritarian hand of the state crushing individuality, which I'm sure that happened. I'm not saying that didn't happen. But you have to remember, they're paying for it. So, the Rockefellers said, look, this is my building. You're not going to paint a picture of Lenin. So why does the Soviet government not have to say the right? This is our building. You're not going to paint an anti-communist, attack on our system. Their argument is probably the same. It's just because it's the state, there's this stigma, right? People think that people having money and utilizing their money to exercise political control, to control political discourse, to control other people's lives, people think that's not authoritarian. That's what the problem in here is. People seem to not understand that having wealth gives you power. And that if you have power by having wealth, whatever. But if you have power by having the government, well, then you're authoritarian. That's what people don't, that's what's missing from capitalist discourse, right? Is having lots of wealth in a capitalist society gives you lots of power, right? It gives you the ability to play by a different set of rules. Look at when Strauss-Kahn, the billionaire banker, was here in New York City. Look at how that case was handled. And when he was accused of rape, look at the details of that. I don't want to get into too much detail, but there's many examples of people with lots of money having a lot of power. If you have wealth and you have power in this society, you're very powerful. People don't think of that as having power, and that seems to be what taints discourse around artistic freedom and civil liberties and all of that, is that people forget that having wealth is having power. They seem to assume that only state power is power, and that's the problem. Am I dressing up for Halloween? Probably not. I haven't done that in years. I did it when I was a child, of course, but I'm not doing it for years. Thanks for asking, though. That is a good question. It was weird. In my little town in Ohio, there was a lot of controversy over Halloween, because a lot of the fundamentalist and evangelical churches did not approve of Halloween. They felt Halloween was a satanic holiday. It was against the Christian religion. So we weren't allowed to have Halloween. We had to call it Autumn Festival. That was. I remember in my little town, we called it the Autumn Festival because Halloween was considered to be anti-Christian, which is a little bit strange because we all know what's the root of the word Halloween? It's All Hallows Eve. All Hallows Eve, which is the night before All Saints' Day from the Catholic tradition, right? Every year, the first day of November, in Roman Catholicism, they have All Saints' Day. And at All Saints' Day, that's the day in which you honor all saints, and it's also the day in which you honor the people who have died that year. There's the Day of the Dead in Mexico, etc. I'm sure people know about that. But, it is a very Christian holiday. Halloween you can't get more Christian than Halloween. I'm sorry. It's the Catholic Church. It's All Saints' Day. It's the Day of the Dead. It's pretty Christian. But if you're an evangelical fundamentalist and you don't like scary movies and you know that your audience is just terrified of, Halloween's more Christian than the Easter Bunny, and thank you for that, Kinky, by the way. Glad you're with us, Kinky, by the way. But yeah, the Easter Bunny, eggs, that's all the spring or equinox. That's a pagan German festival to celebrate the coming of the spring equinox, but, that's considered Christian. The evangelicals never seem to have a problem with that. But yeah, Halloween is All Saints' Day. It's the night before All Saints' Day when there's supposed to be ghosts or something, right? That was the superstition, is right before All Saints' Day, which is the day where you honor all the people who died in your local church. And even my Protestant congregation, we had a Sunday that was, the Sunday after November 1st, where all the people who had died, who were members of the church that year, we would go over their name. It was like a funeral for everyone who had died within the previous year. And they'd say the name of the person, they'd light a candle. And even though it was a Protestant church, we still had that All Saints tradition. That's part of Christianity, right? It's the Catholics originally adopted it with their All Saints' Day. But it's just part of the Christian tradition. And Halloween is the night before All Saints' Day, October 31st, Halloween. And it's just a holiday. And it was believed the night before this holy day in which you honor all the people who have died that year, the night beforehand, all the ghosts came out. That's what Halloween came from. So I don't know why these evangelicals, didn't like Halloween, but they didn't really not like Halloween. They didn't like scary movies. They didn't like witches and witchcraft. They didn't like, it's kind of like the personality, right? We used to joke about pro-life moms, but whatever. But the personality of an evangelical, the kind of person that became a very, very strong evangelical Christian, didn't like Halloween. The Halloween holiday, they didn't much care for it. So, the religious right was against Halloween. So in my school, I remember we had to call it Autumn Festival because we didn't want to offend the evangelicals. And people would still dress up for the Autumn Festival, but you weren't allowed to dress up as anything scary or anything, you couldn't be a vampire or a werewolf. You could be a TV character you liked, but, there was no Halloween. Halloween was not allowed. Very, very silly. And that just shows how silly things can be sometimes. But I remember at one point Halloween was my favorite holiday. I was a kid. I thought Halloween. At this point, I kind of don't like it. I remember when I was in college, I went to the university cafeteria. And they had the place all decorated for Halloween, and they had people, in blood makeup and all this. And I'm like, I'm trying to eat, folks. I found it very difficult to swallow my food. And I was just like, sometimes nowadays I see all the Halloween stuff and all the spider webs and all the people in the zombie outfits, and I just, please, it's just not my cup of tea. I remember one day, I'll never forget this, I was living in New York City, I'd been here 3 or 4 years, and there was a guy at a subway station, and his arms had these scabs on them, like he was bleeding or something. And he kept walking up to people and trying to beg them for money. And I was just, I was grossed out. And I was handing out political leaflets at the subway station. And this guy, who was like my age, with his arms covered in blood, was just, and I just thought, this guy must be, a drug addict or something. So later he walks up to me and he peels off all the bloody scabs all over his arms. He was a hipster. And he was doing a prank. And he said for Halloween, he was being a crocodile. Someone who's addicted to synthetic heroin. And that he thought it was funny. I kid you not. And I just thought he was gross. I had seen this guy, and he's walking up to people with his arms covered in blood, and I just was just like, this is gross. Will this guy go away? I'm handing out political leaflets for a political case I'm working on, and this guy is covered in blood. And then he walks up to me, and he's a hipster. It's fake. And he's like, hey, that was my Halloween prank, because I pretended to be a crocodile for Halloween. Well, good for you, Mr. Hipster. It was gross. It was just, it's like, is the world a better place because that guy did that? I didn't particularly enjoy it. And I was stuck at this particular subway. I'd been assigned by the political group I was in to hand out leaflets at this subway stop, and I had to be next to this guy who really, it was an effective costume, I'll tell you that much. It was a really, really good costume this guy had made. He really did look like a bloody, scabby, synthetic heroin addict. And he wasn't. He was just being a silly hipster. Someone asked me to talk about automation. I see Rob C. asking me to talk about automation. Well, automation is an interesting topic, and that's why I have given so much attention. Stan Lin out in Long Island is making me smile when he says Halloween grossness is the Atlanticist pathology. That's making me smile. But when we talk about automation, the reason I've given so much attention to Andrew Yang, I don't agree with Andrew Yang, especially what he's come out with about healthcare lately. That's definitely not my perspective. You know, I don't endorse any candidate, mind you. There are things I like about Tulsi Gabbard. There are also things about Tulsi Gabbard I don't like. There are things about Bernie Sanders I like. There are also things about Bernie Sanders I don't like. There are definitely things about Andrew Yang I don't like. I don't endorse anyone. In order to keep it real, in order to continue doing my journalism, I'm not a surrogate for any campaign. I'm not, right? And I have to keep a clear head, and I can't be campaigning for anyone. There are different candidates that I might like, but I don't endorse any of them. And honestly, there is no candidate that I'm uncritical of. If I were planning, well, never mind. Anyway, and I, you know, we'll see. We'll see. But someone's asking, am I in the DSA? No, I am not. I am not a member of any political party or any political organization. I am not a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm definitely not a member of the Workers' World Party anymore. That's been years from now. So people still think I'm affiliated with them. They sure don't want you to think that. I'm not a member of any political organization. But back to this point about automation. I think Andrew Yang's candidacy is important because he is warning about the dangers of automation. Self-driving cars. There's potential there for huge numbers of jobs to be eliminated. And this is what people don't seem to understand. There's this book called Capital by Karl Marx, in which he talks about capitalism, the general law of capitalist accumulation, and how the capitalist is constantly revolutionizing the means of production, constantly improving technology in order to make bigger profits. This leads to fewer workers, the problem of overproduction. This is all basic Marxism. So automation and understanding the computer revolution is on the verge of eliminating all kinds of good-paying jobs is something that everyone who reads Marx and is a Marxist should be deeply, deeply concerned about. And Andrew Yang is a bit ahead of his time and probably saying to his own class, to other billionaires, we got to figure out a way to manage the crisis. You think Donald Trump's populist upsurge is a big deal? Well, wait until you see what happened. That's an important conversation to have. I mean, and he's the only one having it. The Bernie people don't really talk about it. But it's the curse that is hanging over our heads. Jack Ma talks about it. Now, I don't agree that Andrew Yang's solution, giving everyone $1,000, is necessarily the answer. I think it would be a start. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed if the government started sending everyone a $1,000 check. I'd think that's a good thing. Now, I wouldn't be in favor of getting rid of all the other social programs and replacing them with everyone just getting a blank, $1,000 check, no questions asked. That's where I start to disagree, and I'm not endorsing Yang's solution. But he's a very important candidate because he's talking about an issue that's on the horizon. Automation is threatening to cut a lot of jobs, and we need to be having that conversation, and that's what Marxism is about. Andrew Yang, and I don't think Andrew Yang's a libertarian. I think he's a Democrat, and I think he's he's one of the, he's much more of a, he kind of reminds you of technocracy, some of his ideas. He's got math. His message is, I'm a really smart guy. I'm bookish. I'm smart. I'm bookish. I can solve the problems facing the country. We need a smart guy. That's his message. Good for him. I think that, and I think the thing about Andrew Yang that I just fills me with rage is that people call Andrew Yang a Nazi and a white supremacist. Folks, Andrew Yang is not white. He's a Chinese American born in Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. He was born on the island of Taiwan. He's a Chinese American. He was not born on the island of Taiwan, but his parents are from Taiwan. He is not white. He's an Asian American. Why in the world does anyone think that Andrew Yang is a white supremacist? Why? And they say, well, Richard Spencer. Well, Richard Spencer also endorsed Bernie Sanders. No one's calling Bernie Sanders a white supremacist. Richard Spencer and the white supremacist crowd have said a lot of positive things about Sanders. Sanders, not a white supremacist. Why in the world does anyone think that Andrew Yang is a white supremacist? He's not. He's just clearly not. And he's had to answer this question. It's not just weirdos on the internet saying this. He has had to answer this question at debates. I noticed a lot of white supremacists liked you. Can you answer that question? No one asked Bernie Sanders that. No one says to Bernie Sanders, Mr. Bernie Sanders, you are endorsed by white supremacists. Do you disavow them? Of course he would, right? No one thinks for a minute. But why do people think that Andrew Yang is a white supremacist? There's no logical reason. There is absolutely no logical reason that Andrew Yang, a non-white person, a person who does not agree with the far right on all kinds of things, wants to give people free money. That's like the biggest talking point of the far right now. We can't be giving people free stuff, Nobody. No one has any logical reason that Andrew Yang is a white supremacist. None. But I'll tell you, and I hate to go here. I really do. Because it's a touchy subject, but I got to tell you, do you know why people are calling Andrew Yang a white supremacist? I know why. And it breaks my heart. I don't want to start crying now. I really don't want to. That would be inappropriate. I'm not going to cry on these lives. Sometimes things make you sad. Sometimes they make you angry. You just have to face them. Why do so many people accuse Andrew Yang, who does not advocate white supremacist policies, is not white himself? Why do they accuse him of being a white supremacist? Why? Because he cares about poor white people. No, I'll be serious. It's not just that he cares about poor white people. Low-income white people, working-class white people, truck drivers who are going to lose their job because of self-driving cars, people in Rust Belt states, people in parts of the South, Oklahoma, low-income white people are a central aspect of his campaign. He has made his campaign almost exclusively about saying that he will improve the lives of low-income white people. And there are a lot of leftists, they're not Marxists, a lot of cultural leftists, a lot of liberal activist types, a lot of hipster kids who hate low-income white people. I almost want to start crying now. It makes me so upset. They hate low-income white people. There's no other way to say it, okay? And no, I don't think low-income white people are oppressed for being white. They absolutely aren't, right? If people of color have far worse conditions, racism is a reality. Low-income white people have what you could call white privilege. No question about it. But, like Kinky says, basket of deplorables. It's a reality. A lot of these urban folks, urban middle-class people who are white also, they have been told to get over their bigotry toward African Americans. They've been told to get over their bigotry toward Latinos, but they love to hate low-income white people. And it's not rational. It's gut level, and it's disgusting. And they see Andrew Yang with low-income white people, which is his campaign. He knows. Why did Trump win the election, folks? Low-income white people. They're a huge demographic in the United States. Low-income white people, look at a map of the United States, okay? Look at a map, okay? Pretty much everywhere on that map, except for urban centers, you have a lot of low-income white people. Low-income white people are a big demographic in the United States. Andrew Yang, wanting to be a successful politician, has made his campaign about appealing to them. And so, the response of liberals is, he must be in the Klan. He must be a Ku Klux Klan member, because anyone who cares about low-income white people, anyone who pays attention to the issues that these people are concerned about, is a white supremacist. It's disgusting, okay? And I'm making enemies here by saying this. I know, and people are probably thinking I'm a white supremacist for saying this, which I am absolutely not, okay? What has bothered me for so long is that the potential for solidarity between low-income white people and people of color is bigger than ever before right now. What is the issue? What is the issue that has plagued the black community for so long? Police brutality, right? The police murder an African American. They shoot him with no just cause. They say, oh, we thought he had a gun. They get away with it. For years, this has been the issue. Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, you go down the line. Well, now, among low-income white people, there is an increasing anger at the police. I kid you not. Something that has been plaguing the black community for years, in numbers that are increasing, is happening to low-income white people. And instead of going to low-income whites and saying, see, the black community and the white community have a common issue here, the police agencies, the policing agencies are out of control because they're trying to control the population amid a drop in the standard of living. A low-wage police state is unfolding in the United States. Instead of saying that, the left has said, no, I mean, it's beyond me. Drug addiction. For years, the black community suffered from drug addiction, and the white community was racist, and it said to them, get tough on crime, lock them up. We all know about racist innuendo and the whole crack baby myth and all of that, and the war on drugs, and it was awful, and it was racist, and it was horrendous. But now, opioid addiction is spreading among low-income white people. So again, there's an opportunity for solidarity here. There's an opportunity. There's a real opportunity to say to white workers, see, the issues facing the black community are also facing low-income white people. And we need to change the drive. There's an opportunity for solidarity here. But again, the response of the left, it's a disaster. Low-income white people, I will say, are far more racist than, this is a broad sweeping statement. Low-income white people tend to be more racially bigoted than other demographics among white people. That's a fact, right? White people who've been to prison tend to be very, very racial. Why? Prisons are very, very racially segregated, prison gangs, etc. Low-income white people often, and I, for years, when I was in Cleveland as a left-wing organizer, I would meet people and I would talk to them about socialism, and they would be open to it. Yeah, we need jobs, we need education, and I'd say, and racism exists, and they'd go, oh, you're one of those, aren't you? And they would immediately, race was the issue that made them right-wing. And for a lot of low-income Americans who are white, it's racism that makes them anti-communist, that makes them anti-socialist, that makes them right-wing. It's nothing else. They don't love free markets. They are just convinced that socialism means helping African Americans, and no one understands what they've been through. I kid you not. The racism of a lot of low-income white people is based on, it's tragic, and it's based on this resentment. They hear about the suffering of African Americans, and they feel like no one cares about the suffering that they've been through. Well, they don't understand the suffering of African Americans, which has been far worse, is rooted in the same system that has led to the suffering in their lives. They don't hear about it. No one says to them, hey, the reason you lost your job, the reason you lost your home, is the same reason that African Americans face racial discrimination. They don't hear that. That's not there. They hear the media, they hear about Martin Luther King Day, they hear about Black History Month, and to them, in their mind, this is an attack on them, which it's not. But class struggle has been wiped. The ideology of the Wobblies. Somebody wanted me to talk about the Wobblies and the IWW. Class against class. The workers and the bosses. That has been wiped out of the American consciousness. Basic social democratic consciousness, the rich versus everyone else, the working class versus the capitalist class, has been wiped out of the American consciousness. And because of that, a lot of low-income white people are convinced that Acknowledging racism, acknowledging what faces the black community in the United States is somehow an attack on them. It's not. It is not belittling the suffering that they have been through to acknowledge that people of color have been through some horrendous things that are far, far worse. It is not in any way, an attack on them to acknowledge that racism exists, to acknowledge, that it's harder to get a job if you're an African American, to acknowledge that but the way political discourse in the United States has unfolded since the 1970s with the New Left, especially since the rise of what people call identity politics, got a lot of low-income white people who assume that any acknowledgement of racial injustice is somehow saying that they never suffered. And that's just not true. That's just not true. That's just not the reality. And, Andrew Yang realizes that Trump won because of the low-income white people vote, right? That's why he talks about the heroin epidemic so much, right? I mean, that's why he talks about self-driving cars and automation. He knows how Trump won. He knows the demographic Trump targeted. Trump, in his campaign, did everything he could to say exactly what low-income white people wanted to hear, and low-income white people went out in droves and voted for him. That's reality. And Andrew Yang is saying, I want some of that low-income white people vote. And that doesn't make you a fascist. If you're inciting low-income white people to hate, that's something else. If you're preaching anti-immigrant bigotry, that's something else. If you're calling for a more authoritarian police state, that's something else. But just saying to low-income white people, hey, I care about the issues you care about, doesn't make you a fascist. But according to some really hateful people, some really vile, elitist people who call themselves leftists, it does. Let's be real, folks. It does. To a certain demographic of people, wealthier people that live in urban areas, as far as they are concerned, any effort to appeal to low-income white people makes you a Ku Klux Klansman. And that is stupid. And furthermore, Bernie Sanders, as Kinky has pointed out in the chat, is way above this. Bernie Sanders doesn't think this way. Bernie Sanders has called repeatedly for the Democrats to have what he calls a 50-state strategy. Bernie Sanders is very, very, he talks a lot about the issues affecting low-income white people, but he also talks about racism, and he talks about systemic racism. He talks about all of that. He is very much in favor of reducing mass incarceration. I mean, he talks about the issues that are important to the black community, but he also talks about the issues facing low-income white people, and that's important too. Class solidarity, folks. It's been lost. There's another live where I ranted about To Kill a Mockingbird. And To Kill a Mockingbird's a great book, but who are the villains? The low-income white people, who is the hero, a wealthy white person, and the people of color in To Kill a Mockingbird are just seen as kind of helpless victims being rescued by the... it's like that dynamic, that To Kill a Mockingbird lineup, where the hero is wealthy attorneys, the poor, helpless victims are people of color. They never fight for their own rights. They're just victims, right? And then the villains, of course, are low-income white people. That dynamic in politics is a setup for disaster. You want to talk about fascism? That dynamic, right, will lead to when low-income white people are being told that wealthy white people and people of color are their enemy. That dynamic doesn't lead anywhere good. And that's how U.S. politics has been set up for a while, really since the end of Roosevelt. Since the 1950s, U.S. politics has become more and more that demographic. Wealthy, urban white people aligning themselves with people of color against low-income white people. That's a disaster. It should be low-income people of color and white working-class people aligning themselves with low-income people of color against the ruling class. Class solidarity. That's what needs to be there, and that's what's missing. Right now, the American people are being whipsawed. I've talked about this in many classes, right? An old whipsaw. What's that? It's a saw with two hands on it. When one guy's pushing, the other guy's pulling. And that's what happens. And it's funny because if you go to most countries around the world, there's a trend in politics they call regionalism, where people don't vote on the basis of ideology. They vote on the basis of what region they're from. And that's increasingly how U.S. politics is becoming. Give it time. I think things in the United States are going to become more like the developing world in terms of politics. And it'll be much less about, do we want the government to not be involved? And it'll be more and more about, who does the government help? Does it help my demographic or does it help your demographic? That's not good. That's not a good way to be. The answer to that is solidarity. The answer to that is bringing the country together. But it's a mess. It's a big mess. I've spoken my mind about this. I'm sure I'm getting a lot of flack for this. And, I'm sorry. If you can't face the reality of what I'm saying here, that's not my fault. But, it's a reality here. I am not apologizing for racism. I am angry. I've spent many hours arguing with people that are low income and are white and believe things like police brutality is made up, and that's a lie, that sit there and insist there's no such thing as police brutality, insist that there's no such thing as racism, and they're wrong. And they're absolutely wrong. But when you get to the essence, if you argue with them for a while, you get to the essence of what they're saying I've suffered in my life. And if the left could acknowledge that these people suffered in their life and point them towards solidarity with the African American community that has suffered more, with the immigrant community that has suffered more, there might be hope. I don't know. I don't know if folks saw on Twitter, there was an African American man who's a Trump supporter who tweeted out that the USA is, so many $1 trillion in debt, and that's why we shouldn't be giving food, housing, and an income to all these people who've entered the United States illegally. And I tweeted back at him. I said, it's funny. I don't believe that the U.S. government has a program where it gives a free house and free housing and free health care and free incomes to everyone who crosses the border illegally. In fact, most people who cross the border illegally are hiding from the government. They're getting paid less than minimum wage, and that's just not a reality. But there's a lot of people that believe this. There are a lot of people who have it in their heads that every undocumented person gets a bunch of free stuff from the government, no questions asked. That's not reality. That's simply not reality. All right? There are a lot of people, who are undocumented in the United States right now, but they certainly don't get, a whole bunch of free stuff from the government. It's the opposite, right? And they pay into Social Security, they pay taxes, and they don't collect any. They don't collect any benefits. They can't get unemployment insurance if they lose their job. They can't get food stamps. They can't get any of that stuff because they are not U.S. citizens. So it's just a myth, right? And it's really unfortunate. And that's the way U.S. politics has developed, where, again, it becomes this, well, the government helps everyone but me. I've got it the worst. No, I've got it the worst. The government should help me. No, the government should help me. The government should help me. It's just this mess. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's a big, big, big mess. The U.S. working class is being played against each other. We're all being played against each other. The standard of living is going down. Drug addiction is increasing. The police state is increasing. Poverty is increasing. And we're being played against each other. Julian Drews is saying, well, racists are not overwhelmingly poor. Well, I should have rephrased that. I think you got a point there, Julian. Let me say, low-income white people are the most explicitly racist, in my experience. Wealthier people, plenty of bigotry there, plenty of assumptions about people, but they know how to talk, right? When, it's, white people who've been in prison, white people who are very low income tend to be much more unfiltered with their racial bigotry. But yes, there's plenty of, there's plenty of bigotry, and there's plenty of prejudice, yes, among wealthier white people. That is absolutely true. But they know not to be public with it. That's a very important point, Julian Drews, and I'll give you that. Perhaps I should have rephrased what I said earlier. And the racism of wealthier white people is a little bit different too, right? Because a lot of times, wealthier white people do have a bit of a white savior complex. Maybe they are racist. Maybe they wouldn't hire a person of color. Maybe they wouldn't be happy if their son or daughter married a person of color. But they still have in their mind, they know enough to know that people of color have a hard time. They want to feel like they're helping people of color in kind of a condescending way, but they still have their own bigoted kind of assumptions. It's more complicated, you know. But you want to talk about explicit open racism, that tends to be low-income folks, and it's based on resentment, and it's based on an assumption that what they've been through no one cares about. No one cares about their hardships that they've had. It's very complicated. It's a very complicated situation. This is depressing, folks. I am thoroughly not happy about talking about this. But let's talk about something else. What else is on people's minds? What else is new, folks? There's a lot we can talk about today. I do hope you will tune in to that interview I did with Dakota Lilly, because it was great. He was just in Venezuela a week ago. I mean, he just got back from Venezuela. It's a kick-ass interview. It's great. You're going to like it. It's going to be awesome. Yeah, I mean, all over the world, people are protesting, and part of me worries. You know, there are all kinds of people rising up against imperialism and the neoliberal regimes it has imposed. There are all kinds of people being mobilized by imperialism to beat back, you know, countries like China, countries like Venezuela, countries, you know, like Bolivia that are resisting imperialism. People are out in the streets on both sides. There are pro-imperialist demonstrations going on. There are anti-imperialist demonstrations going on. And, you know, it is what it is. And I worry, folks, as much as I'm excited for the people in Chile that are rising up against neoliberalism, the people in Ecuador that are fighting against the cuts in social spending, at the same time, I must say, I'm concerned. You know, I worry that this, you know, right now it's just protests out in the street, but I worry about what, you know, the ultimate culmination of this could be. Right? Before you had the Second World War, you had the Battle of Cable Street, where the British working class fought Oswald Mosley in the streets. You know, you had fascists and communists fighting each other in the streets all over Europe. Then you had the Spanish Civil War, with fascists, you know, trying to overthrow the Spanish Republic and communists defending the Spanish Republic. And then you had World War II. And, you know, this is an escalation. And I mean, it's good to see people rising up against neoliberalism. It's good to see that these pro-neoliberal and pro-imperialist demonstrations are not having their intended effect. The Venezuelan government is still in power. China is not going to give up Hong Kong. But I worry this stuff is escalating. This stuff is really escalating. I mean, there's danger. You know, I've ended a lot of my presentations and a lot of my YouTube lives by quoting Mao Zedong. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. I believe that's true, right? And I believe that the danger of a new world war is becoming more and more true, but at the same time, I do believe that revolution is the main trend, right? The people of the world want a better life. They're tired of historical progress being held back by the irrationality of capitalism and greed, you know, and that the drive of the people to utilize science and acquire better conditions, that revolutionary energy, that is the main trend in the world today. That is the main trend in the world today. Not violent revolution, not destruction, not chaos, but the drive to advance. Right? That's where the word revolution comes from. Right? It comes from revolutionaries who believed the earth revolved around the sun when the Catholic Church was forcing people to believe something different. And I believe that revolution is the main trend in the world today. But the danger of a new world war still exists. The people of all countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today. And when I talk about divisions in U.S. society and the fact that people are being played against each other, let me emphasize once again, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That's what we need. We need a government that will take concrete action to improve people's lives and can work with a mass movement of people to control the means of production. As long as the greed of the capitalists remains at the steering wheel of U.S. society, things are only going to get worse. As long as the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market, preliminary transformation into capital defines economic activity, things are only going to get worse. But it's with a government of action. It's with socialism and human reason dictating production and controlling the economy that China and Russia have become superpowers. It's with a government of action that people all over the world have been lifted out of poverty. Huge things have happened in the 20th century when countries broke out of the imperialist order, of capitalism in its monopoly stage, of Western bankers controlling the world. And people around the world seized control of their countries when the state controlled the means of production, when the irrationality of greed was kicked aside. Amazing things happened. Bad things too, but amazing things did happen. And socialism is constantly evolving, becoming more effective. We see what the Bolivarians have done. We see how socialism with Chinese characteristics has evolved. The crisis of automation, of overproduction, is laying the basis for socialism to emerge more strong and powerful than it has ever been. And that's a reality. So while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Thank you very much, folks, and have a good night.